J-Lance Mallamo is the director of the Office of Historic Alexandria. You probably mostly know that. He's going to highlight demolished buildings in Alexandria tonight, hence the title. He's been the director of Historic Alexandria for about 10 years, and he's responsible for the leadership, management, and oversight of city-owned historic sites, including the Archaeology Museum, the Black History Museum, Fort Worth Museum and Historic Site, Friendship Firehouse Museum, Gatsby's Tavern, Lloyd House, Stabler, Leadbeater, Apothecary, this building that we're in, and many other things, including all of this staff that work for the Office of Historic Alexandria. And he's wrangled a deal to add the Mary Dick Fawcett House at 517 Prince. That's a pretty amazing portfolio and a plume in your hat, Lance, to have acquired that particular property. That was an amalgamation of funding sources, and probably most of you know that. It was valued in terms of real dollar value of $1.2 million and an in-kind gift from the current resident. Anything else we should know about that, Lance?
Well, we are beginning to raise funds for an endowment. We have our first commitment for $100,000, so we'll be providing information out on that in a short amount of time, and we would welcome all contributions of support from $1 up on up.
Thank you.
So,
he has been a significant contributor to the comity of the city that we live in, and particularly in terms of history preservation, and education for history purposes. That's both at the primary level, secondary level, college level. It's quite an accomplishment. I mention all this because we have a cake in the back that's going to celebrate him. And before we do that, that cake will be cut after the lecture. Before we do that, I want to ask all of you to applaud because this is his retirement coming up in November. So let's give him a round of applause. Come on forward, Lance. It's time for you to put on your show.
excellent. Good evening, everybody. I'm really proud to be here tonight and pleased to fill the shoes of Jim McKay, who was scheduled to give this lecture. As you may be aware, Jim retired suddenly several weeks ago and was unable to do the lecture tonight. And maybe it was Gretchen. Somebody said to me, what are we going to do about Jim's lecture? Should we cancel it? And I asked, what is it on? Lost Alexandria. I thought I can do that, so I hope you'll bear with me. I put it together yesterday, and I had my 3 hours all set, and Gretchen said it's too long, so I whittled it down to about 2.5 hours. No, truthfully, I should have 50 slides. I have 82. Every time I went to take one out, I was like, oh, I can't take that out. That's important. So there's a whole host of pictures that should be in here. I even thought I should break this into two, but as Patrick said, I'm going to be retiring November 30th, and my plans short-term involve a palm tree in Florida, and then I'll be coming back and waiting for my wife to come home from work, so I couldn't commit that I would be in a position to do this. So let's get started. Now, I did want to say this was one preface before we get going. Jim's lecture was billed as based on the collection of Dr. James Good, which I must confess, I didn't really read the release on this until yesterday, and I had already finished the presentation, and I was like, oh, what collection is that? I did track it down, and more than half of my pictures tonight will be from that collection. So apparently they were put together for a book that was planned many years ago that was never written. I brought my notes, so I actually may write the book, because I've got a good start on it. I'm going to try and go quickly through these, but if you have questions, don't hesitate to ask. And if there's a fact you want to know about, I probably have it right here in the book. So without further ado, can somebody dim the lights? First off, how many of you remember when Washington Street looked like this?
What year is this?
This is about 90 years ago. This is looking north on Washington Street. I know Dr. Jacob Clark, my ophthalmologist, his office is right in this building over here. That's probably one of the few things that I recognize here. It's really...
Question, is the row of lights closest to the wall on a separate circuit?
I
That could go out entirely?
don't know. Does anybody...
I have no idea.
What street light is that?
That's going to be up at Wythe Street, I believe it is. This is taken from Cameron Street, is right here on the right, also looking north. Probably the only thing remaining in this photo, believe it or not, is the gate to Christ Church and the brick wall on the left side. Oh, and there's one other thing.
Leave some lights on.
How'd I do that? Okay. If you look right here, you see this tree right here? That is also original. That's a whole other show. Interestingly, I've been able to document that tree back to before the Civil War. So, and it's the only one left of a row of 12 that were planted. So I will come back another time, we'll talk about that tree.
Which one is the synagogue?
The synagogue would be right in here.
Down the trees.
It's behind the trees. Let's see, here's Cameron Street going to the side of Christ Church right here. As you can see, it's primarily a residential boulevard. It changed to commercial, a historical fact. 62 years ago tomorrow, City Council approved a resolution changing the zoning to commercial. So even though this was at the time in a historic district, the BAR at that time was more focused on retaining the 18th century look of Alexandria and not necessarily the historic buildings. And clearly, you know, Victorian buildings like this one didn't fit that theme, and this one over here, so they probably really weren't too concerned about it. Today, we would be very concerned about it. And some really remarkable buildings kind of left the town. This is one of my favorites. It's a classic Greek revival called Grosvenor House, which was actually the name of the hospital that it was named during the Civil War. This was at 414 North Washington. It was built for Anthony Cazenove, who was a Swiss immigrant to Alexandria in the late 18th century. He was one of the few Alexandrians that spoke fluent French. So when the Marquis de Lafayette came in 1824, he was the personal liaison to the Marquis and spent the whole month with him. 6 years later, he built this house and then lived here with his family until the Civil War broke out. And it was used by the Union Army in conjunction with the Lee Fendall House as the Grosvenor Hospital. The gardens in the back were filled in, and a ward of 20 by 100 feet for 160 beds was built. Back here, they had a dead house for corpses and sanitary facilities and laundries, etc. After the war, Brigadier General Montgomery Corse made this his residence, and then it was owned by the Leadbeater family for a number of years. It was taken down in the late 1950s and auctioned off literally in pieces. They sold the window glass, the pieces of the house were put up, so it wasn't just demolished, it was taken apart. Here's another great house at 306 North Washington Street. This is the Herbert Bryant house. This was built in about 1881. There was an office building on this site. Some of our older residents may remember it. It was In later years used by St. Mary's Church for a boys' school with the Zavarian brothers living on the 3rd floor. And they sold it, the school closed during the Depression and they moved on, but another beautiful Second Empire house at that location. And this lovely home, the original name was The Shadows. It was the George Hill House. You remember George Hill. He bought the Jameson Bakery from Robert Jameson and the cracker biscuits that Queen Victoria loved. He transformed it into the Hill Steam Bakery. Originally he was at the Jameson site on Water Street and later Lee Street. And then he moved into the Delahaye and Kemp millwork factory across the street, where he increased the size of the bakery. That burned down in 1895, but he lived with his family in this house. This was built about 1854 for a man named Robert Rubens. Unfortunately, Mr. Rubens died the following year and the house was auctioned off. It was a lovely Greek revival style. Actually, it's very similar to another house we're going to see next. Just the roof line is different, but the 5-bay, the classic central doorway there. And this was located at the corner of Franklin and South Washington Street, 617. It was demolished about 1975. This is the day it was torn down. That photograph was taken February 9th, 1974. Preservationists tried to save it, but were unsuccessful. Some of you may have been involved in that battle. Just around the corner was Arch Hall. This was the home of Lawrence Lewis and Nellie Custis. If you remember those names, their main house was Woodlawn Plantation off Richmond Highway. This is where they spent the winters on Franklin Street between South Alfred and South Columbus. There is a townhouse complex there now. This house was moved in the 1950s down to Lorton on Belmont Bay, and it's been completely restored, still intact. This is because of the trees here at the time this picture was taken in the 1930s. You can't see too much of the house, but you get some idea of the simple grandeur on the inside, that lovely entrance hall. Very, very nice 18th century building, built at the same time as Woodlawn House. Kind of on the north end of town, Bellevue. This was a home built in 1801 off Slaters Lane for William Hodgkins and his wife Portia. They gardened on the site. It was 17 acres, and the house is right over in this area right here. It became more famous in 1840 when a man named John Slater bought the property. Mr. Slater had worked with William Yates at the Yates Garden and learned horticulture then, and he really developed this site into a horticultural masterpiece, primarily growing vegetables. Even through the Civil War, he continued to grow vegetables that were consumed by soldiers, and we have a newspaper article where it says these are the finest strawberries, both in appearance and taste, that the editor of the Alexandria Gazette had ever seen. So this is, of course, where the Marina Towers and the Morant plant are built today. The Alexandria Almshouse, which was the poorhouse, built about 1801 at Monroe Avenue, which at the time was named Poorhouse Lane, and Richmond Highway. This is where the Simpson Field would be located today. Boy, if you had to be poor, what a nice place to spend your time, huh? It's just a lovely classic home with that beautiful Palladian window. This served as the city's poorhouse for over a century, right up until the 1920s when it was moved down to Manassas. They built a regional home for the indigent in Manassas, and this became vacant, so the city owned the property. They sold it to a man who was going to develop a hotel here. He started as a boarding house, and he just couldn't make it. He went belly up. The city was holding the mortgage, so they took it back, and they didn't know what to do with it, and some school kids started playing ball in the back of it, and that's kind of how our Parks Department in Alexandria began. The city was like, okay, we'll let them play ball here, and we can store the balls and bats in that old house, on the corner. And then as the park developed more and they built a small seating and had more recreational equipment, it was kept in here. So this was in many ways one of our first recreational spaces in the city. Another great building in the 1100 block of Orinoco Street is Kollross. Beautiful home, also built at the turn of the 18th century. This was owned by the Smoot family. You can see it's quite a lovely building, and unfortunately it was hit by a tornado in the early years of the 20th century, and so that damage that you see there, it kind of blew the windows out and took features off, so the building sat for a number of years and was left vacant. Then it was taken apart brick by brick and moved, believe it or not, to Princeton, New Jersey. And if you know anybody who goes to the Princeton Day School, this is now the school. So there is the building today as it looks in Princeton. Really quite a massive building to move up there. It was built by Alexandria merchant John Potts in 1799 and acquired by Jonathan Swift in 1803, who added the additions on the west. Oh, another great early Alexandria building. This building was where the Campagna Center is today, and this was Alexandria's Lancastrian School. Anyone heard of a Lancastrian School before? Okay, it's a great method. I actually think they should bring it back. My wife is a school teacher, and I tell her if we could bring this back, we wouldn't have half the nonsense in schools that we have today. This was actually built when Alexandria was part of DC. It was built in 1812. It was actually built to educate African-American students. If you recall, the Alexandria Academy, George Washington left a small endowment to use the upper floor for African-American boys to study. And in 1812, they were moved to this building. Relatively small, but it was built in a very interesting design. The Lancastrian method was a no-nonsense attempt to lower the cost of public education. So you had, the system was called mutual instruction. Older students would help younger students. So the students were arranged in rows, first grade, second grade, third grade, and then their mentor was right behind them. So they could oversee what the younger students were doing. The floor was on an incline, and the teacher was at the lower part of the floor, and then it cascaded up in concentric rows so that the students can see. You see, the windows are very high up. It's because they didn't want the kids looking at the window and getting distracted. The furniture was bolted to the floor. None of this, you're moving your desk, you're moving your chair. It was really no-nonsense instruction. The school did well until 1847 when Alexandria was retroceded back to Virginia, and then the school closed because in Virginia, it was against the law to educate African-American children. So the school was vacant for a number of years and finally closed. This photo was taken in about 1880. And it was taken down, I believe, about 10 years later. Yes, 1887. And then the Washington School was built on that site. Another building from Alexandria's role in DC is the Alexandria Jail, which was located on St. Asaph Street. This was built in 1826. They did a report of the existing jail in Alexandria in 1823, and it concluded that murderers did not deserve to be put in that jail. It really must have been horrible. So they built this structure, which was designed by Charles Bulfinch, who was an architect of public buildings in the District of Columbia at the time. And here I have several shots. This is taken from let me back up, a woodcut print, broadside. It's a much smaller piece of it. And this is an aerial view of the jail and its yard. You see the wall there is 20 feet high. Now, actually, if you go down St. Asaph Street today, we'll say at Pendleton, this wall and this wall, end of the building, are still intact. So you can still see them. They look a lot better than they did in this photograph. And you can see this scruffy open yard right in here. This is the area where executions took place if you were guilty. And also, another interesting thing about this jail, a little known fact, if you were an African American and came to Alexandria at the beginning of the 19th century, you had to prove that you had the financial means to live in the city for 2 years. So if you were free black, you came in, you had to prove to the city that you were not going to be a financial burden on the residents or the citizens of Alexandria. If you couldn't prove that, you were put in jail in this building, and you were charged a fee of 22 cents a day for your food and board. Well, of course, if you didn't have the money to live for 2 years, where were you going to get the 22 cents a day? It was a catch-22 that, you know, the Hotel California of Alexandria, I guess. Once you checked in, you couldn't check out. Well, if you were in jail, of course, you had to be tried. And this is where people were tried in Alexandria. This is the Alexandria County Courthouse, part of the District of Columbia. You can see here, here's the map of the original district with Washington County and Alexandria County. And here's the growing city of Washington and the neighborhood of Alexandria down here. This building was designed, this was at North Columbus and Queen Street by Robert Mills, who also was the original architect for the Washington Monument. This is what his design looked like. This proved too costly, so they kind of cut out the colonnade at the base and made it a lot simpler than it was. But quite a lovely building. Federal style, had 8 offices on the lower floor, and then the dual circular staircases. Of course, staircases, you had to go upstairs to a court because you had to go through some aspect of pain to get justice. That was a philosophical theory in the architecture of jurisprudence. And then the courthouse itself was semi-circular with jury boxes and towards the rear of the building, a lobby in the center, and then this and the room on the other side would have been the jury rooms. And a large cupola on top that tolled the church bell, the court bell when court was in session. Now, of course, when Alexandria was retroceded back to Virginia, this is where the votes were counted. So that night of May 23rd, 1860, I'm sorry, not the retrocession, the vote to secede from the United States, the townspeople celebrated and an African American sat on the curb and cried. The Octagon House, another great house, out on King Street. At the time it was in Fairfax County on Leesburg Pike. For reference, there's Aspinwall Hall in the background. At the seminary, you can see Alexandria was a lot more open at the time. This was built in 1856 by a Reverend Robert Hall for his wife and daughters. It was to a design espoused by Ogden, what's his name escapes me, the phrenologist. Let's see if I can, Fowler, Ogden Fowler. And he felt the octagon design would bring you mental and physical health benefits, and it was also much more efficient. So Reverend Hall wanted to experiment. He obviously experimented a little too much. He built it in 1856. Later that year, part of the house collapsed because it had structural defaults. When the Civil War broke out, the Reverend had died. His wife and daughters were living here. She didn't want to be on the outskirts of town, so they moved into town. The Union Army took it over as a hospital. When they abandoned it, the house sat vacant and ransacked. Mrs. Hall came back to what she described as a heap of ruin, and in 1866, just 10 years after it was built, it was burned to the ground, a victim of arson. Another great house, the Tuscan Villa at 508 Wolf Street. This was part of the Wolf Street Hospital. This house was built in the, I believe it was 1850. It was used as a Civil War hospital, and this is Wolf right here. This house in the background is also part of the hospital. That is still there. And this now had been turned into a synagogue after the war and now was acquired into townhouses. This was in the 1870s a home of John Marshall, who was a businessman and bank officer of the city. It was taken down in 1961 to make way for the Federal Hill townhouse development. Really sad, one of the most spectacular buildings in the city. Another great early building, the old Virginia House, built in the 1820s by Lucian Payton, who lived at Payton Gardens, just a block away. This was a hotel for the cattle drovers who came to town. Many of them stayed at the Cat's Tavern at the end of Diagonal Road and Duke Street, and when that filled up, people would come over here. Mr. Payton cut corners in building the building, and it was originally 2 stories, and then he thought, well, if 2 are good, 3 are better, so he added a 3rd story, but unfortunately the structure had never been physically designed to hold 3 stories. So it was very routine for walls to collapse. The roof collapsed at one point in a large storm. The whole facade on King Street fell over. At the point of where it's called here the Old Virginia House, it was actually a hotel for African Americans, and it had been turned into the Hotel Jackson. And Mr. Jackson was active with civic groups in Alexandria. He had an emancipation celebration here in 1903, and it was a local branch of the National Negro Businessmen's League. In 1927, as I said, a tornado took this whole wall down, and the city insisted the building had to come down. This is a building, if you go there today, it was turned into the Coca-Cola bottling plant, so you'll see that same curve on the front of the building. I'm gonna have to move it up here because I got a lot more to go. So, all right, here's Brown's Mill down off Wheeler Avenue and Cameron Run. This was a grist mill built about 1812. It was grinding flour and cornmeal right up until the 1920s. The building was only taken down in the last year. Very, very sad end for this building. Okay, as we get into the Civil War era, Battery Rogers, this was down at what's now Lee and Green Street. This was one of the defenses of Washington. It was started in 1863. It was named for George Rogers, a U.S. naval captain who was killed in an attack on Fort Wagner in Charleston, South Carolina. It included a 180-foot-long main-face gun, 5 200-pound Parrott rifles, and 1 15-inch Rodman gun. And that gun is right here. And you can see that gun is so big, a man could get in the inside of it. You can see, while Alexandria was really well defended in the Civil War, these guys had plenty of time on their hands to get into mischief. So that's probably the only action that gun ever saw, was when that guy got in it. Okay, next we're going to talk about the Soldiers' Rest, built in the 1862 at Street between Fayette and West. This is right along the railroad tracks, so Duke Street would be over here. There were 2 gates, so this gate right here is going to be right here in this corner. This is where soldiers returning to the front could come back and rest and recuperate, and soldiers going to the front could get off the train, stay a couple of days in Alexandria, and then be sent to near certain death further south in Virginia. There's a large dormitory right here, 3 stories high. You can see clerestory windows right in the back here. Right here are the sanitary facilities for officers. There's a covered walkway. Here's the dining room and the kitchen right here. This is where the men who worked at the site every day and never left, this is where they lived. And there's a parade ground right over here, and an American flag with a large oval to congregate. And when this filled up, you could go in a tent over here. And then this campground went all the way to West Street. But it's quite a architecturally attractive complex of buildings built in the Carpenter Gothic style, board and batten. Some other buildings built by the military here in Alexandria are the U.S. military railroad houses that were right here. These are adjacent to the Alexandria Roundhouse, the train station, which was off Henry and Duke Street right here. And also, this is one of two photos I know of, and maybe, Catherine, if you know, are there more than two? Because these are the only two I know of that feature a picture of the original steeple of the Friendship Firehouse. Remember the Friendship Firehouse was built in 1855 on St. Alfred Street, has that large cupola, what originally had a steeple that was twice as big. It didn't last 15 years. The winds hitting the steeple continually racked it, helping to pull the roof off the firehouse, so they finally had to take it down and lower it. They put the small lower cupola, but I will tell you, until like 6 years ago, the cupola did the same thing. When we restored it in the early 21st century, we did it with materials that were not available in the 1870s. So it's not racking the building any longer, but it certainly did. And this one it's a very poor quality photo, but it gives a great silhouette of what the steeple looked like. So, Hunting Creek Bridges. Here are, this is a view from Shooter's Hill looking over the original village of West End. This would be where the Carlisle development is built now. And this in the distance is the Richmond Highway bridge over Hunting Creek that was built in 1809. There's the toll building right in the center. And then this 1827 view shows that same bridge. This is all filled in by the Beltway interchange now. And right here is the rail bridge of the trolley line that went to Mount Vernon. This would be Broomielawn Point, which was the city's unofficial recreation ground, where the Hunting Towers apartments were built later. And the Freedman Cemetery would be right around in this area right here.
How was that picture?
This is 1927. Vaucluse, out on Seminary Road, another great home. This was the summer home originally of Dr. James Craig, who was encouraged to move to Alexandria because of his military association with George Washington. He urged him to come here. He had a home on Duke Street and a summer home out in this area. Very typical at the time. People in Alexandria had a summer home 3 miles away because of the different infectious diseases that would typically ravage the city during that time. Later, it was acquired by the Fairfax family, who lived in the Lord Fairfax house at Fairfax and St. Asaph Street. Not Fairfax Street, Cameron Street and St. Asaph. Mrs. Fairfax, Ammonia Fairfax, her granddaughter was Constance Carey, and her father had died, and she and her mother had come here to live with their grandmother. When the Civil War broke out, they left downtown Alexandria and they moved out to Vaucluse. Vaucluse means closed valley in French. That's the definition of that. We have no photos of it, but that's what the house looked like. They weren't there but a few days when the Union Army came and evicted them, ordered them to leave for Richmond, and subsequently the house was turned into Fort Worth. Constance herself buried the family silver in the basement of the house. After they left, Judith McGuire, who was the wife of the principal at the Episcopal High School, wrote the following. This is on July 30th, 1861. Vaucluse, too, the seat of such elegant hospitality, the refined and dearly loved home of the Fairfax family, has been leveled to the earth. Fortifications thrown up across the lawn, the fine old trees felled, and the whole grounds, once so embowered and shut out from public glaze, now laid bare and open. Vaucluse no more. How tragic. Well, luckily for Constance, she came back and she dug that silver up. She got that silver. She became kind of the Tokyo Rose of the Civil War. She went down to Richmond and wrote under the name of Refugita, which was a propaganda magazine from a Southern belle to Northern soldiers. She was also a member of the Carrie Invincibles. She and her two cousins were part of the Girls of the Golden Circle, who would crochet little knitted decorative hair pieces and pins and sell them to Union Army officers who would send them home to their wives, and then they would take the proceeds and send them to Richmond for the Confederate forces. This is the site now of Alexandria Hospital. Brimstone Castle and the Hoffman Sugar Mill in the 200 block of North Washington. Now you can get your bearings here. This building in the background is Lloyd House. So this was the building next door. Actually, Mr. Hoffman lived at Lloyd House before the Lloyd family moved in, and he operated a sugar mill here. He would take sugar that came from the West Indies, and it would be processed here by slaves in this building. Later, when Benjamin Hallowell operated a school at Lloyd House, he rented the building, and when Mrs. Elizabeth Hoe died, who was his landlord, he hoped to buy the building at auction, but he was outbid by John Lloyd. So he moved the school next door. He bought this parcel, used this building, which was called Brimstone Castle. That was its kind of play name. We don't know why it was called that. There is a fort in the West Indies named Brimstone Castle, and it was built by slaves, and it was to defend sugar plantations. So I'm like, okay, this isn't a big stretch that the students of the school may have come up with this name, because it was not the official name at all. But you also see there's like a tower in the background, a cupola. If you went through this gate, there was a arcade that was left to the two buildings. This picture was taken during the Civil War, and you can see they've added the Widow's Walk at the top to see out to the Potomac River. I don't know what was going on in this room that they needed that ladder, but that's a whole other thing going on here. Great shot of City Hall. In fact, a few city halls. There were 3 city halls built on this site. This one right here is the second City Hall on Royal Street that burned to the ground in 1871, and it was rebuilt as this building. Now, this is the clock tower that was designed by Benjamin Latrobe, who did the original U.S. Supreme Court building at the Capitol. And I almost suspect that the steeple is the original. It's so close to this one that I think maybe the steeple fell over and they were able to rehabilitate it, because I have read that the clock tower was saved, but clearly it wasn't. If you look at this one, it's flush with the facade of the building, whereas this one is set back. There's no tower in the base here. This is a view from the back of this building looking from Fairfax Street from a window at the Mansion House Hotel, and this is where you see the original Market Square, how these are the market stalls in here, and these are the stalls before 1870. This building that we see here, this Beaux-Arts design, was by Adolf Kloos, who had come to America. He was one of the 48ers from the German Revolution of 1848. He was a espoused communist, but in 1870 in Alexandria, Washington, nobody really knew what a communist was, and they really didn't care. If you could design a good building, you were hired. And he designed a building built for people to be fireproof and extremely safe. The building was more important than the look of the building for the safety of people. So Mr. Kloos may be known as the Red Architect, but he did some great City Hall. Robert Portner's Brewery. This is up where Trader Joe's and Talbot's is on North Washington Street. This was Alexandria's biggest industry in the 19th century. There is now a Portner's Brewery, out on Van Dorn Street, but this was the original building here. You see all these buildings were involved. Even the old Mount Vernon cotton mill was the bottling plant. And then when this was taken down, they built a Woodward and Lothrop department store here in 1955. And in building that store, they actually uncovered the vaults from the where they would age the the brew under the building, so that was quite a problem. Wood and Lothrop, this store closed after the was built at Landmark Mall, and it was taken down in 1994, and the current complex was built there. The Alexandria Mount Vernon Railway on North Columbus Street. Well, this is the train, which is on North Columbus. This is Cameron Street right behind us. This was the original route from Washington down through Alexandria. It went down Columbus, turned on King Street, and then went down both Royal and Fairfax. Went down Royal, came back up Fairfax, and then would go down Royal Street all the way over the rail line over the Hunting Creek, and then down through Wellington Villa, all the way to Mount Vernon, where it turned around and would then come back. This is now the route of the GW Memorial Parkway. That was 1892. In 1908, when the Rosemont development was built, they added this very elegant station and at Rosemont near Commonwealth Avenue. And the paper described it as, this would be much appreciated in any New York suburb. And, you know, I'm from New York, and we have a lot of railroad stations that kind of look like this, so that must have been unusual here in Virginia for the time. I just kind of love that quote. Okay. Well, let's talk a little bit about King Street. King Street was pretty much a sleepy little street. This is a shot in the 1920s, 30s, 30s, because this building is apparently open there. You get a view here of what that area of King Street, of course there was no metro station, the Union Station would have been back here. Over here is the Baggett Stadium, which was a ballpark, and to keep the balls inside they put these large billboards up. Can you imagine billboards on King Street at any time? Over here is the Sanitary District Grocery, which later became known as Safeway. It was assumed into the Safeway chain. And we had a lot of car dealerships down at this end of town and gasoline filling stations. Now, if we looked at the same area in an aerial view, this picture is taken in 1927, you'll see at this point, this is Prince Street. Prince Street does not even go through yet. So it took decades for the city street to be built out. Even, you know, when we come up Route 1 to come into Alexandria, Route 1 from Franklin to Gibbon Street has to be the most heavily trafficked route in the morning. Well, that wasn't even there until like the 1930s. You had to turn right on Franklin and go down to Washington Street and then make a left. This was known as Hoof's Meadow. This is where they would graze cattle and horses when Alexandria was kind of a town where the cattle drovers came in. All the breweries were up over in this area of West End. And then here's Hoof's Run, which is now encased in concrete underneath the street. So that's a rear view of that area. Back on the east end of King Street, here's the 300 block. This is the early 1960s. How festive, huh? Doesn't it really looks so depressing? It's like, oh, wow. You can see here at this time, I understand, I'd be the first one fighting urban renewal, but I kind of get it that they wanted something different because it was getting very run down, and this is at the very beginning of urban renewal, and what gives that away is this building right here, which was the new Alexandria Bank building. The original bank was across the street, and when that building was taken down, they built this one to move over to. Some of the other buildings that were taken down for urban renewal, the First National Bank at 503, 507, probably the most spectacular interior room in Alexandria when it was built. Just an amazing room, one-story bank, but 4 stories high, and just this barrel vault ceiling with a marble on the interior and out. Now, interestingly, this is built or designed by the same architect, Milton Morrill, who designed the Rosemont Station. He was with the Washington firm Voight and Morrill. But he lived in Alexandria. He designed both buildings the same year. So both those buildings are 1908. Here's the bank just down the street, the Citizens National Bank. These two banks later combined in the First and Citizens Bank. The John Adams Silver Shop at 318 King Street. You probably can't tell it from this photograph, but this is an early 18th century building that had been modified many times over the years. This was the workshop of one of Alexandria's greatest artisans, John Adam. An example of his silver is right here. The William Gregory buildings, this is another late 18th century building. William Gregory was from Kilmarnock, Scotland, where he had a wool and carpet factory, and he sent his son over, and they imported them here to Alexandria and served them out of this building. If you look close, there's still a couple of buildings like this along King Street. You have to look really hard and kind of look around the sides, because most of the times the fronts are altered. But that classic hip corner roof kind of gives it all away. And this was another part of the Gregory holdings too, this building. Now, you notice anything interesting in this photo? It's these signs. If you do a study of King Street photos in the 1960s, virtually every restaurant is a greasy spoon, luncheonette serving the City Hall lunch crowd, and all their signs have 7-Up or Coca-Cola on them. I wish we had one for our collections, because there are just dozens of these all over the city. This is the 500 block, a great example of wonderful 18th and 19th century architecture. Even this building was a beautiful Victorian facade, but in the 1950s, these people are trying to catch up. Shopping centers are coming in. Alexandria is losing its mojo as the retail capital of Northern Virginia. So the Haymans slather their facade in raw concrete to make it look brand new. And then they added down here, now I don't know if that's what's going on in here or not, but they would either have mannequins or live models that held their pose. And people would stand there and waiting, is it a mannequin or is it real? And then the person would walk across and tell you the price of the dress. Here's Schumann's, the bakery. And that was the old James Devon house from the 1700s. And here's Leonard Schumann and his famous jelly cake. Talk about lost Alexandria. This was lost, but now it's found. You can still buy the jelly cake online, thank God. It's made with currant jelly and very thin sponge cake. Here's another one next door, the Adam Lynn First House. Adam Lynn was a jeweler, silversmith, and hardware merchant in Alexandria. Very interesting. Everybody seemed to have a trade. This is an 17th century building, 1700s. That's what I meant to say. So if you look close, you can see that here in the architectural details. And then he built this tenant building further down. Originally it was 2 stories and modeled the earlier one. Then he added this 3rd story, and someone came back and took the roof off and made a cornice roof. So this is actually a much older building than it appeared. This is all where the Alexandria Courthouse is today. At 320, the old Alexandria Pawnbrokers. Now, believe it or not, in the 1960s, Alexandria had half a dozen at least pawnbrokers. In 1913, Congress passed a law that pawn dealers in Washington couldn't charge usurious interest rates in loans. But they could in Virginia, so everybody came to Alexandria. So the Washington police had an officer assigned. He would come down here once a week to see what stolen goods from Washington were showing up in Alexandria. Timbermans Pharmacy. This is at the corner of King and North Washington. These buildings are still there. This is a building, I forget what it is now, but it was Magnolia on King. This is where La Quotidienne is. It's a different building here, but the ghost of this roofline can still be seen on the wall of these buildings. There were two Timberman brothers who were pharmacists. This one was operated by John. This is in the 1920s, based on the automobile and the dress of this gentleman right here. John eventually sold his property. It was torn down. He built a new one further back on North Washington Street. And that building, if you want to see the neon sign from that, just go down, right downstairs. We have it. We've just restored it and hung it, and it's lit in glorious neon, which would not be allowed in Washington Street today. But, and then a young clerk here was Edgar Warfield. Anyone ever heard of Edgar Warfield? We're going to hear about him in another minute. This is a view looking down King Street looking west. Here's that Timbermans Pharmacy again. Here's the John Gordon House. This is still there on that corner where Francesca's is. This is Mr. Knight's stationery shop, built in 1906. Here's the Five and Dime store. This was ground zero for Christmas toy shopping. These windows right up here, because that was where the toys were sold in Alexandria right up until the 1950s. This is a view of the same intersection in the Alexandria Sesquicentennial Parade in 1907. And then here at Pitt Street on the north side is where Edgar Warfield, who had worked at Timbermans later, he built his own pharmacy at 510 King. Edgar was 18 years old when he joined the Confederate forces. He actually developed the Old Dominion rifles even before the Civil War broke out, and they would drill at the old Catalpa lot up off North Washington Street. He fought in the war, came back. It was his idea to build the Appomattox statue, and he was there at the dedication. He was also the last soldier alive in Alexandria from the contingent that left to represent Alexandria's Confederate forces. Well, he built this building, a pharmacy on the ground floor and apartment access from this door right here with beautiful mahogany and walnut materials. He really spared no expense. This is one of the finest 20th century early urban buildings built in Alexandria. And you can see here, this would really be at home in any great Eastern American city. And that's what Edgar hoped Alexandria was going to become. Well, talking about the Civil War, we're all familiar with Marshall House and the death of Colonel Elmer Ellsworth, who took the flagpole from the roof. And then the ABC store that was built there in the 1950s. But who knew, took me a while to figure out, this building, the Marshall House was actually renovated in the 1880s, and they made it look like this wedding cake structure. And that's the building that was taken down when this one was built. So really, it looks like a completely different building, but if you look really close, you can see it is the same. Grocery stores. Where'd people buy groceries in Alexandria? This one was the district, the DGS, or the district grocery store. There were about half a dozen in Alexandria. This one was at Princess and Payne Street, and these were basically mom and pop grocery stores. Before we had supermarkets, you bought your groceries in here. I mean, I guess the salmonella came free because it looks so dirty. And then the store owner lived above with his family. So very, very compact. Another great building built in 1880, the Alexandria Armory. This was the center of civic life on South Royal Street for many, many years. There's a small pocket park and children's playground at this location today. In the 1950s, there was a plane crash with Capital Airlines, and like 80 people were killed. Well, those corpses were stored here until, because the morgue facility at the hospital was in the local area was not large enough. Here's the old Alexandria High School. The city bought the site here in 1912. This is where Jefferson Houston School is today. But unfortunately, the land was not in city limits. And they were like, well, gee, can we really build a school that's not in the city of Alexandria? And while they debated that, they decided, well, we'll annex that property. So they annexed it and went a little bit further west, and then they built this building. this building the following year. When they annexed further and took in town of Potomac, this school was too small, so they had to build a GW high school. The Mikkel House on Russell Road. This was built for Frank Mikkel, who owned a furniture store here on King Street. Really, who would have thought the guy who owned that little furniture store could build this house? He must have been running books in the back or something, I don't know. He built it for his wife, and unfortunately she died about 2 weeks before they moved in, but he did move in here with his daughters. Believe it or not, this is still there, although the only way you can tell is like this is the only part you can see, this little end gable. It's now part of the Delray Baptist Church and Alexandria Presbyterian Church off Russell Road. They have literally built wings on every side of this building. Even they took the portico down and built another building on the front here. So, and wings on the side. So you just see these two popping up. I was really stunned when I drove up there and saw that one day. This is another great building. This is still there. This is Ray Artisans on Mount Vernon Avenue. So I'm not talking about the building here. I'm talking about health chivalry, which they are practicing here. This was built by Arlington County because in the 1920s, this building was in the county of Arlington, and they built this health center here, and the nurse was Nurse Sue Brown. She looks like a nun. She actually had 6 children at home. And these are her health crusaders. This was a program of the American Lung Association or the Tuberculosis Society. I forget which one came first. The people that developed the Christmas seals, and they developed this program where you would enroll little children. They would give you a pattern, and you'd cut these little capes and hats out of paper, and the children would wear them. And they would walk up and down the streets of Alexandria, King Street and North Washington, and they would give people the basics of health hygiene. Don't spit on the sidewalk. Shower at least once every 3 days. Brush your teeth at least once a day. They were fully armed with that. In fact, this little girl right here, in 1929, there's a picture of her on the front page of the Washington Post in that outfit selling Christmas seals to Mrs. Herbert Hoover at the front door of the White House. So this was kind of a big deal. I think it's a great program, and these little health crusaders really were too much. So where'd we go for entertainment? The Capitol Theater at Queen and Henry Street. There are at least 4 theaters on this site before this one was built for African Americans. And just 1 block away, well, we'll get to that one in a minute. Here's the Vernon Theater on Mount Vernon Avenue. This is its opening day in December of 1940, an Art Deco masterpiece. This is where the AutoZone store is now. The Reed Theater, this is built where the Baggett Stadium is on King Street, named for Harmon Reed, who owned all the theaters in Alexandria, the Virginia and the Ingomar, and when he went to build a third one, he's like, I'll name it after myself. This was one of the first theaters to incorporate retail, not associated with the theater, into the facade of the building, and neon signage. Really quite and it's the first theater to have a parking lot, 1,000 cars. So that would have been the old ball field of the Baggett Stadium. And the Virginia Theater at 601 First Street, another Art Deco masterpiece. But what's so interesting about this is this ad that I found that talks about how light, the use of decorative lighting, could keep your theater in the black. That apparently was a revolutionary new concept. This theater on the interior had, see these niches right here? These were paintings of birds in a shimmery paint by the Magliotti Studios in New York City. And they used black light to light these. So when all the lights were on, these just glowed. And when the movie was playing, they just had a very soft shimmer. It also, the lighting was built into the floor to guide people out. You could empty your theater much quicker and bring up the house lights. You could do all these special techniques with these newfangled bulbs, even fluorescent bulbs here, like it was a totally new concept in theater design. And the Carver Theatre here, here it is in 1964. I can tell that by this little Corvair right here in the front. This was originally the Carver Theatre. And you know the Carver School is right across the street from that. That's the former Negro Nursery on Fayette Street. And, you know, we've always had this discussion, well, who was it named for? Was it George Carver that it was named for? We really don't know that. They never said that. But this theater was decorated with murals of George Carver. So I tend to think, yeah, they had a theme going on here.
Is that facade still there?
Yes, that facade is completely intact, although it is missing the crown. And I think the crown just like makes it, totally makes it. And unfortunately, they've replaced all of these windows. See how they, I'm sure, you know, the BAR or somebody said, let's have little colonial apothecary windows in the side. These are gone. Look, even the men's shop is the Carver men's shop. It's really, really something. But it's a great site. Oh, this is one of my favorite buildings. This is Strawberry Hill. This is out on Duke Street. Would have been Fairfax County in the historical period. This is South Early Street and Wheeler Avenue right down here. This house was right here. It was an old farmer. A doctor lived here, Dr. T.H. Smith, who was an Alexandria physician. Later it was purchased by the Cockrell family, who ran the Brown's Mill, which was just down here. And they owned a hardware store up here on Duke Street later on. Later, it was an antique shop. This was now a townhouse development built in the 1960s. Huh? This one? This is the railroad line. That's Duke Street. Duke Street is right up here. When I was doing research on this and I looked at this photo, this kind of caught my eye, like, what's going on down here? What is that? And originally I thought, okay, when you take aerial photos, they're huge files, and sometimes you tape them together and the coordinates are kept in the corners. So I go, okay, that totally makes sense. But I decided to keep blowing it up. And I was like, gee, it really says 57 and 57, and there's another 57, but they look like they're in different stages. So like, and here it is really closer, but when I got really close, it says Heinz 57 varieties. This was built to take advantage of people passing on the train to advertise Heinz. And Heinz actually had a program. I actually got a letter from a man in Idaho. They had one in Idaho. And the Cockrell family, in 2001, we had a oral history that's on our website from a member of the Cockrell family, and he talks about this, that they did it, and the Heinz company paid them rent, and it was his job every summer to go out and paint the letters. They were concrete. And the reason there were 3 of them, like they did this one, and then they got on the train and you couldn't see it. So they were like, okay, forget that one. And then they did this one, and you can only see part of it, and that's not going to work. So then they finally got down to that one. So another great story. There's an industrial park here today, so there's nothing left of that. Howard Johnson's on North Washington Street. I'm going to start moving quicker here. The only Hojo's not built with an orange roof that I can find. It had a slate roof because it's Alexandria. And this is a little tourist nerve center up at this end of North Washington Street. I don't think residents actually ate here. It was pretty much tourists. There were motels. There was a little tavern up there, you know, which is the hamburger place. See here in the background, there's the roller rink sign, and there's the roller rink. This had a skating floor, 100 by 200 feet. 3,000 people could skate at the same time. Really quite an amazing building. And this lovely hot shops owned by the Marriott Corporation. And would you believe it, Bill Marriott's brother was the manager of this hot shots. I mean, I can't even imagine J.W. Marriott, the big hotel downtown. His brother was slinging hash here in Alexandria. And what is this peculiar little polar bear, you ask? Well, that's Beck's Frozen Custard Stand. That was next door. These are the buildings that I'm sure is the reason we have a BAR in Alexandria now. The National Park Service was like, these are not memorializing the George Washington Parkway, and you have to do something. Look at the icicles here. And if you look close, this is concrete with glass bottles. They broke glass bottles and like pushed the glass into it. So when the light hit it, it kind of shimmered like an iceberg. Who knew we had 2 bridges over the Potomac River in Alexandria? The federal government during World War I realized, well, we had no bridges at that point. It was just the Long Bridge. And they thought, if that gets blown up, we need a secondary bridge. And we need it now. We don't have time to build one. So they went out to Michigan. They took this bridge over the Mackinac River, moved it to Alexandria, put it over the river. You can see here are the 2 ends. And to get your bearings, here is the traffic circle up by, as you go around. Here's Slaters Lane. Or this is Bashford Lane. So here are the train tracks. This was a rail bridge, and then it would go right back up. And, what piqued my interest here, I had no idea that Blue Plains sewage plant was there in the 1940s, but obviously it is. So the bridge stayed for about 4 years, and then they took it back to Michigan. But if you look at an aerial photo today, you can still see where it was. Here's Cameron Station out off Duke Street. And this is what it looked like when it was run by the Air Force. Here it is today with townhouses. Here's what it looked like at the turn of the 20th century when the lakes here were part of the city's water system, Cameron Lakes. Here's an example of, it's not a building, it's a tradition. We had a big military presence during World War II in Alexandria, and for up to 20 years later, they always had Army Week in Alexandria. And look what happened. The stores all put Army people in the windows. They had parades. The trailer camp salutes the Army. Banners across Washington Street. Imagine if somebody would propose this today. It was like never happened. The Mighty Midget. You all remember this one, right? No. Okay, this was on, I'm sorry, this is not, me bad, this is not Pitt Street, this is Wolf Street, behind the CVS Pharmacy. Is that Wolf or Wilkes? I think it's Wilkes Street. This little building, Joe's Grill, was one of the Mighty Midgets, and the Mighty Midgets were a nationwide fabricated hamburger stand. You couldn't go in it, you had to walk up to it, buy your food. So if you worked nights or you just wanted something on the run, it was great. These were, believe it or not, made from old airplane parts after World War II. There was a guy in California stuck with a warehouse full of aluminum, and he made these. Unfortunately, for Alexandria, there was one out in Leesburg, and one night 3 teenagers stole a Triumph and didn't know how to drive. They crashed into it and totaled it. So the guy there bought this one, and they moved it out to Leesburg. It's still out there. It's the back end of a restaurant today. And the Donut Dinette on Mount Vernon Avenue. Now, I only have an interior shot of this building, but I was able to locate it at this address. First I didn't know, was this the one at 4121 Mount Vernon Avenue? But believe it or not, this house is still here on Glebe Road. It's 3 windows and a bay window on either side of the front door. So I was able to prove that this is the one. This is now in 4 Mile Run Park. So the building isn't there, but it's just a glorious tribute to aluminum and Formica. Now when King Street retail started to go down, Mount Vernon Avenue shopping centers, and shopping centers where you could park your car and shop, you didn't have to walk 10 blocks like we do here in Old Town, sprang up, including this one, Arlandia. And this is where Arlandia gets its name, from Arlington and Alexandria were put together in this shopping center. The opening day here, they had fireworks, they had bands. It was really an amazing thing. This one, the Powhatan Shopping Center. Now, you would be hard-pressed to even find where this shopping center was. It was at a main location when it was built in the 1940s at Powhatan Street and Route 1, and then they realigned Route 1, and this is now like somebody's backyard off Powhatan Street. So the building was taken down, but it's quite, an acting market at People's Drug, the basic staples, and look at this modified colonial cupola up there. Rural Laconia. So we're at the point where Alexandria starts to change from a walking community to a motorized community. And so I'm talking here about what's going on in the West End. Well, this is the West End, really even up to the 1940s and 50s. This is what it looked like. It's hard to believe in 1950 the West End had less than 400 people, and 10 years later it had 80,000. This is just amazing. Here's Lancastrian Road, which is now like a 6-lane highway. It's just farms and dirt roads. And what changes all that is the construction of the Shirley Highway. This was named for Henry Shirley, who was the Virginia Department of Roads superintendent. He authorized this building of this highway just weeks before World War I broke out. It was November of 1941, and no sooner did the ink dry on the contract. World War II, sorry, World War II. No sooner did the ink dry on the contract than Mr. Shirley died, and the greatest honor they could pay to him would be to name the highway after him. So that's where it gets its name. And look, it's a 4-lane road. This is actually before it opened, so that's why it has no cars on it. It's built in, I'm from Long Island, so this is built into the model of the Long Island State Parkway system, which are the earliest parkways in the United States, with stone bridge and overpasses like this, which were designed by Robert Moses intentionally so that trucks and buses could not get under them. He only wanted people who owned automobiles to use the parkways. And Shirley probably didn't know better, so he just followed Moses' design. This road really didn't last too long. It's been modified so many times since this construction, this is not even recognizable any longer. I believe this is King Street. And here's what this highway does. Now, our West End, and to get your bearings, here's North Quaker Lane, South Quaker Lane, Braddock Road, and here's King Street. Now, North Quaker at this time, believe it or not, is called Seminary Road. Although we have a Seminary Road down here, that's Alexandria Seminary Road. This one is in Arlington, so they could have their own. Now, this big tract right here is called Morven. This was the summer home of John Carlyle, who built Carlyle House. He had his summer estate out here, and his family, his descendants lived here for generations. It was later called Tudorwald, and this was a horse breeding farm. The house, built about 1775, is right up here. Well, you see, in 1940, the house is there. 10 years later, it has the Shirley Highway going right through it. So they tore the house down, and this is now Fairlington. See this swath here? This is where airplanes used to land in the 1930s. They could land there. And you just see what's going on with this whole, everything is just developing almost immediately. Right across the street on the other side of King Street is Minokin. This is the home of Cassius Lee. These are the only two photographs I know of Minokin. There's Cassius Lee himself on the front steps, and here's a lower view of the house. We get a better picture in these aerial views in 1940. Here it is, right here. Here's Morven, and here is Minokin. Fort Ward Park would be like over here. And this is Robert E. Lee's cousin. And you see they're still farming parts of the property, but these sections, they've already started to let go of. These are starting to infill, and then by 10 years later, the house was taken down in 1951, and the property was developed into the Bradley Shopping Center. But you see here by 1950, this is no longer farmland. This is scrubland. So kind of sad. This is the Episcopal Seminary down over here. And here's Oakland Baptist Church over here. Alexandria mid-20th century architecture, you know, in the early years of the 20th century, we're kind of evoking, we could be this northern Williamsburg. So the city, when they build new buildings, the Firehouse looks like a suburban colonial home. The health department looks like a dormitory at William and Mary, and even the city incinerator looks like the Wren building at William and Mary. Even the police department on Pitt Street does that model. Here's our model today for civic architecture. I guess we've given up on that Williamsburg thing going on, but it was fun while it lasted. Some other buildings that go up on the Shirley Highway, the Key Motel on Duke Street, and the Patton's Townhouse, this little quasi-colonial with a capital K, with a built-in pool. This is now 25-story apartment buildings on this site. Landmark Center, I included this, Lost Alexandria. It's like the last time the parking lot was full there. You see how popular this was in the 1960s? And Alexandria Scrap, anybody remember this? This is where Carlisle is today. It was a scrap yard there for decades. And
What was the other one? At Landmark, was there an outdoor movie theater there?
no, that's part of the building. This is part of the building right here. It was actually called Landmark Center before. These are the pre-mall days. And you just look at the streets. I mean, it must have been total gridlock getting in there at that time. Okay, this is going to be my last slide. I just want to say demolition is not always intentional. This is the horrible Tingmoy laundry collapse in 1941. This is at Commerce and King Street, where the little Skanandaga totem statue is today, right here. They were building a building here, didn't shore up the adjacent site, which was a laundry facility. And the whole wall of the laundry, this is an 18th century building, fell in. The floors collapsed. 3 people were injured, but the greatest calamity were 1,000 shirts were ruined. So you know, sometimes demolition is not intentional. Okay, that was quick. I think I'm way over. I hope you enjoyed my presentation. Do I have any questions? Maybe we could bring the lights up, Patrick? Yes.
Way back, you mentioned the Princeton Country Day School
Yes.
and the house that was moved up there. Well, I'm from Princeton.
Kollross.
School, but the point is, what's the name of the house that was moved?
The name here was Kollross. Koll, Collross. Kollross. Yes. Do you know the building in Princeton?
Yes.
You're gonna go see it now, aren't you? Yes, ma'am.
So where are these photos now? I mean, are they at Office of Historic Alexandria, at the library? Are they accessible?
Well, the James Good collection, which has about half of these photos, is available at the library. Many of the others are on the Library of Congress website. A few are probably only in OHA's collection. Because, you know, I may take a photo within a photo just to grab a piece of it out.
But the food collection's at the library.
That's at the library, right. So if you walk in this Petra Collections room, it's going to be in the left-hand corner under G. It's a notebook about this thick. It is a wonderful collection. If I had seen it before yesterday, the one building I had never seen in my life, which blew me away, was the Lord Baltimore filling station on South Washington Street. Anybody ever see that? Oh my God. It is a colonial revival site for sore eyes. This gorgeous stone building with a cupola and antique lighting fixtures at the gas pump, with Lloyd Baltimore filling station. It was taken down in the 1950s. What a terrible, terrible loss. Because I've never seen a gas station like it. Really, it's just fabulous. That alone is worth the trip to the library to see that. Yes, anything else? Okay, well, yeah.
I'm on Franconia Road and was looking the other day and found it's a Rooney League. Her house was moved on to Cannon Lane, where I live, and talked to the owner the other day. But adjacent to that was Oliver Howard down on, was that the Bush Hill?
Mm-hmm. Bush Hill, yes.
So,
I had a picture of Bush Hill. I took it out. I had to cut it short. Look at the time, ladies and gentlemen. God.
in the library as well. Can I look at that?
Yeah, Bush Hill. Yes, that will be in the library. Yes, it definitely will.
It looks like, I guess, Hitler's right hand was held there in the detention center.
Oh, I didn't know that, but I learn something new every day. But I'll tell you, great. We have a few in OHA's collection. We have a few great early aerial photos of Alexandria from 1927, 1936, 1949. Another great website that you can use for free is called historicaerials.com. And that's an amazing site because you can overlay an aerial photo. The earliest one they have of Alexandria is the 1949 photo. But you can overlay that photo with aerial photos from almost every 5 years from 1950 to 2015. And you can see how blocks change. Literally, you can zoom in right on a house. So I use that all the time to date when houses are demolished. If it was there in 1985 and not there in 1988, I know it's in that period, and I know right where to look for the demolition permit. It's a great site. If you learn how to use it, you'll just love using that site. So.
Okay, let them eat cake in honor of that.
Okay. Thank you.